Let's take a look at regulation and behavior. So these are a few of the questions that we'll try to be able to answer throughout this video. We want to be familiar with abiotic and biotic factors and be able to give examples. The two stages of protein synthesis, we'll definitely go over that. The difference between operant and classical conditioning, right? It's a little psychology coming at you, but that can show up on the exam. We'll go over that. And what do consumers feed on to survive? Okay. So I think the title looks like it's just a little bit outside of the top here. So it's herbivores, carnivores, omnivores. We'll go over each of these. So herbivores mostly eat plants, while a carnivore mostly eats meat. That's probably the one people are the most familiar with. And omnivore eats both plants and animals. I would say the ones that students get the most mixed up on, if any, on this one is usually omnivore. Just remembering that omnivore is both plants and animals. Okay, so we jump into the food chain. We'll go over each of these. Producers are any kind of green plant. Green plants make their food by taking sunlight and using the energy to make sugar. Okay, so while that's, pretty standard information on plants, remembering that producers are any kind of green plant is going to show up in one form or another on the test. Consumers feed on producers or other consumers to survive. With decomposers, they take all the dead animals and plants and break them down into their nutrient components so that plants can use them to make more food. These organisms keep ecosystems healthy by ensuring plants get the nutrients they need to survive. With the primary decomposers, in many ecosystems, they are fungi. Fungi decompose organic matter by releasing enzymes to break down the decaying material, after which they absorb the nutrients in the decaying material. And then finally we have autotrophs, and they are the producers in a food chain, such as plants on land or algae on water. And just kind of to quickly summarize here, again, if you only had one thing that you could get out of this, all plants are producers. In the aquatic ecosystem, algae is also a producer. Decomposers feed on dead or decaying organisms. Fungi and bacteria are the two most typical decomposers, but snails show up quite a bit as well. So those are really the ones you want to be familiar with. Again, decomposers, thinking fungi and bacteria. Those are the examples that are likely to show up. Okay, abiotic and biotic factors, pretty straightforward. An abiotic factor are the non-living parts of the environment that can have a major influence on living organisms. Abiotic factors include things like water, sunlight, oxygen, soil, and temperature. And the living things in ecosystems are called biotic factors. Living things include plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, things like that. So most likely you're not just going to get a definition. Unfortunately, it won't be quite that easy, right? Saying the non-living parts of the environment, is it abiotic or biotic, is they'll probably list out four things like water, sunlight, oxygen, and plants, and which one of these is biotic? It'd be something like that. Okay, operant and classical conditioning. So as I said at the beginning, you've got a little psychology going here. Operant conditioning is a type of learning where behavior is controlled by consequences. The key concepts in operant conditioning are, we got four of them: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. So really the key ones are that would show up almost for sure would be the positive and negative reinforcement, and connecting that with the operant conditioning, as opposed to a classical conditioning, which could be referred to as a Pavlovian or respondent conditioning, but for our purposes, classical conditioning is what you'll be asked about on the test. That refers to a learning procedure in which a biologically potent stimulus, which usually would be food, is paired with a previously neutral stimulus, which would be a bell, right? And so, what that would mean is every time a bell was rang, the rat or the mice would get like a little pebble of food, right? And then they kept ringing the bell, pebble of food, and eventually they would ring the bell and no food would show up, but like the mice or the rats already would be drooling and saliva coming out of their mouths because they had gotten used to the idea that when they heard the bell, that meant they were going to get food. Okay, so that's classical conditioning. Okay, innate behaviors here. Innate behaviors are genetically passed from parent to offspring and do not require learning. Right, so that's the basis of innate behaviors. So we go into some of the details. Looks like we got about 5 of them here. Circadian rhythm, that's an animal's daily cycle and is influenced by environmental factors such as temperature change, daylight hours, availability of food and water. Circadian rhythms are physical, mental, and behavioral changes that follow a roughly 24-hour cycle, responding primarily to light and darkness in an organism's environment. Okay, but again, so with all of that stuff, really the thing you want to be able to focus in there on circadian rhythm is it means 24-hour cycle, right? And if you know that, that's probably going to be enough to be able to figure out the answer for any question you might get here. Mimicry is a common behavior in various animals, and it's often used to create a false appearance in order to fend off predators. Right, that makes sense. It's exactly what the word sounds like, to mimic something. Homeostasis is the tendency of the body to maintain a balanced state regardless of external changes. So a thermoconforming organism adopts the surrounding temperature to its own internal temperature. Enzymes are catalysts. That's really the big one to remember, that they're catalysts. Almost all metabolic processes in the cell need enzymes in order to occur at rates fast enough to sustain life. The set of enzymes made in a cell determines which metabolic pathways occur in that cell. And then with ectotherms, so species of reptiles, fish, amphibians for the most part are ectotherms, which means they rely on the external environment in order to regulate their body temperature. Okay, those are all the innate behaviors that we need to know. The endocrine system, so I mean, you can get really detailed with the endocrine system, but just like as the big definition, which is all we need for the purpose of this exam, the endocrine system is the collection of glands that produce chemicals that regulate things such as metabolism, growth, and development. Right, so again, really the key word to focus in there on is regulation, right? Regulating metabolism, growth, development, endocrine system. If you have that, you're in pretty good shape. Okay, proteins and the protein synthesis. So the making of proteins is really fairly simple. First, you need an amino acid. Another nucleic acid that lives in the cell is transfer RNA, also called just tRNA. It's bonded to the amino acids floating around the cell. With the messenger RNA offering instructions, the ribosome connects to a tRNA, transfer RNA, and pulls off one amino acid. With protein synthesis, there are 2 main stages. The first stage is known as transcription, where a messenger molecule, which will just be called mRNA, is formed. This molecule is transcribed from the DNA molecule and carries a copy of the information needed to make a protein. In the second stage, the messenger RNA molecule leaves the nucleus for the cytoplasm, where the cell's ribosomes read the information and start to assemble a protein in a process called translation. Okay, so that may have sounded like a lot, right? For protein synthesis, you need to be familiar with what transcription is and what translation is, right? So that may, if you already know it, great. If you don't know it and it's something that you just forgot from high school, then you're going to have to go back and make sure you have a good understanding of transcription and translation. Otherwise, protein synthesis questions, which do show up, might be a challenge. All right, and that gets us back to our questions, right? So we went over each of these. What I always recommend when we have questions on our videos is at this point, hit the pause button, try to answer these. If I just go and answer them for you again, it'll make complete sense. It'll seem very easy, and the likelihood that it sticks in your mind isn't really that great, unfortunately. Much better if you go through it, and if you have to go back into the video again and listen to me talk about the answer, so especially like protein synthesis, people struggle with that a lot, right? Again, I'm not even going to say what it involves, but you want to know that. So that's what I would do. I'd hit the pause button, and hopefully we can answer all these questions.